He grew up believing that his mother had died during childbirth, but an unexpected discovery calls into question the entire story he had heard for years. Gradually, buried secrets begin to emerge, revealing a cruel truth. Now, he must confront whoever lied to protect him or to control him. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. The Albright mansion stood imposingly high in South Kensington, London. Seen from afar, it resembled a tropical palace, with its meticulously manicured gardens, an infinity pool, and a privileged view of the London skyline and the River Thames. But for Caleb, the only son of construction magnate Richard Albright, those marble walls were his private prison. At 12 years old, the boy possessed an enviable collection of video games, imported toys, and designer clothes he never wore. His room, decorated by a famous designer, even had a small private cinema. Despite this, Caleb spent most of his time sitting on the balcony, watching the children in the park below, free to run and play. "Caleb, your father is arriving for lunch," Mrs. Eleanor, the governess, announced as she entered the room, "and he wants you to be presentable." The boy didn't respond. He continued looking at the horizon while the woman picked out his clothes. Richard Albright was a man of inflexible routines. He lunched at home every Wednesday, precisely at noon, and demanded that his son be impeccably dressed, as if for a business meeting. Caleb got up unenthusiastically and began to change. Mrs. Eleanor helped him adjust his dress shirt collar, her fingers agile and gentle, always with a care that went beyond obligation. "You look sad today, my angel," she commented, adjusting the boy's brown hair. "Did something happen at school?" "The teacher asked us to do a project for Mother's Day," Caleb replied, his voice low and contained. "Everyone is bringing their mothers for the presentation." Mrs. Eleanor's face lost its smile for an instant. Her hands paused in the air as if unsure where to go. It was a forbidden subject in that house, a topic that made all the staff avert their gaze. "I'll speak to your father about it," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's no use. He'll just say I don't have a mother and that's it." That was the only answer Caleb had received his entire life. "Your mother is no longer with us," Richard would say, without ever explaining what that meant. There were no photos of her in the house, no memories, no stories. It was as if she had never existed. Lunch proceeded in the usual silence. Richard read messages on his phone between bites, while Caleb played with the food on his plate. The only sounds were the clinking of cutlery and Richard's occasional comment about some business deal. The large dining table, with seating for 20, amplified the distance between father and son. "How's school?" Richard asked without looking up from his phone. "Fine. Just fine? You need to try harder in math. I don't want mediocre grades." Caleb nodded without saying anything. His father never asked if he was happy, if he had friends, if he liked his teachers. He only demanded excellence. At the end of the meal, Caleb gathered courage. "Father, the school is having a presentation for Mother's Day and—" Richard raised his hand, interrupting him. "I've already spoken with the headmaster. You are excused from that activity. But everyone else is participating. Enough of this subject." Richard stood up, adjusted his immaculate suit, and left without looking back, leaving Caleb alone with his disappointment. The boy remained seated, staring at his empty plate until Mrs. Eleanor came to collect it. "Come on, dear," she said gently. "How about we go to the kitchen? I made that brigadeiro you like." In the kitchen, an area forbidden to Caleb by his father's rules, Mrs. Eleanor always created a small world of warmth. There, away from Richard's watchful eyes, she allowed the boy to just be a child. As they ate brigadeiro straight from the pan, Caleb observed the way she laughed, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, small gestures that for some reason seemed familiar to him. "Mrs. Eleanor, did you know my mother?" he ventured, knowing it was a dangerous question. Her spoon paused in the air. Her smile wavered, and for a moment, Caleb saw something in her eyes he couldn't name, a mixture of pain, fear, and something deeper. "Better not talk about that, Caleb. You know how your father gets." "But I need to know. There isn't even a picture of her in this house." Mrs. Eleanor squeezed his hand tenderly. "One day you'll understand everything, my dear. I promise." That promise, whispered like a secret, echoed in Caleb's mind. There was something in Mrs. Eleanor's gaze, a hidden truth he was beginning to intuit. At night, after everyone else was asleep, Caleb wandered through the silent corridors of the mansion. He stopped before his father's office, a place strictly forbidden to him. He hesitated for a moment, then turned the doorknob. It was locked, as always. Frustrated, he returned to his room. Passing by the service corridor, he noticed a light coming from Mrs. Eleanor's small room. The door was ajar, and he could see her sitting on the bed, looking at something in her hands. It was a small book, or perhaps a box. When she noticed his presence, she quickly hid the object under her pillow. "Caleb, you should be sleeping." "I can't sleep." She smiled, that smile that always seemed to hold a secret. "Come here." When he approached, she ran her fingers through his hair, a caress that had calmed him since he was little. "You know, you have her eyes," she murmured, so low he could barely hear. "Whose?" Caleb asked, his heart racing. Mrs. Eleanor seemed to realize she had said too much. She adjusted herself, moving slightly away. "Nothing, my dear. I was just rambling. Come on, time for bed." But that phrase kept pounding in Caleb's head. Her eyes, she could only be referring to his mother. That was confirmation. Mrs. Eleanor knew his mother, knew who she was, what she looked like. As he walked back to his room, an idea began to form in his mind. There was something strange about that house, a secret everyone seemed to know except him. And most intriguing, why did Mrs. Eleanor, a mere employee, show him so much affection? Why did her gestures of affection always seem to hide something deeper? Lying in his bed, staring at the ceiling, Caleb made a promise to himself. He would uncover the truth about his mother, no matter the cost. And he had a strong feeling that Mrs. Eleanor held the key to this mystery. Outside, London glittered under the moonlight, indifferent to the secrets that mansion held, and inside it, a boy rich in possessions but poor in answers began to suspect that his life was built on lies. The days in the Albright mansion followed a predictable routine, as if time passed slower within those luxurious walls. Caleb observed Mrs. Eleanor's every move, following her discreetly through the corridors, attentive to every detail. Something had changed within him since that night he heard her speak of her eyes. One Saturday morning, when Richard had travelled to Manchester on business, Caleb found a perfect opportunity to investigate. Mrs. Eleanor was in the garden, instructing the gardeners about the new orchids to be planted. The boy took advantage of her absence to sneak into the small maid's room. The room was simple, almost Spartan, contrasting drastically with the luxury of the rest of the mansion. A single bed, a modest wardrobe, and a small table with a chair. On the table, a picture frame turned face down, as if hiding something. With a pounding heart, Caleb picked up the frame. It was a photo of a younger Mrs. Eleanor in front of a small house in some country town. She smiled in a way he had never seen, free and carefree. Turning the object over, he noticed something hidden behind the photo. Carefully, he removed the backing and found another hidden photograph, a young woman holding a baby in her arms. His heart almost stopped. The woman in the photo looked very much like Mrs. Eleanor, only younger and with longer hair, and there was something about her, something in her eyes that made him feel an immediate connection. Could this be his mother? And the baby? Could it be him? "Caleb, what are you doing here?" Mrs. Eleanor's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, a look of panic on her face. Quickly she approached and took the picture frame from his hands. "That's not yours," she said, trying to hide her nervousness. "You shouldn't touch other people's things." "Who is the woman in the photo?" Caleb asked defiantly. "And the baby?" "It's no one. Just a cousin of mine and her child," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "Now go. Your father wouldn't like to know you were here." But Caleb didn't move. "You said I have her eyes. You were talking about my mother, weren't you?" Mrs. Eleanor paled. For a moment it seemed she would collapse, but she quickly regained her composure. "Caleb, please don't ask questions that could cause us trouble. Your father has his reasons for acting the way he does." "What reasons? Why won't anyone tell me anything about my own mother?" Caleb's voice rose, years of frustration exploding all at once. "It's my right to know." Mrs. Eleanor looked around, as if fearing someone might overhear, even with the house practically empty. "Come with me," she said, taking his hand. She led him to the back garden, where a small fountain gurgled, away from the ears of the few staff present on the weekend. They sat on the stone bench, and for the first time, Caleb saw Mrs. Eleanor as truly vulnerable. "Your father is a powerful man, Caleb. He has a lot of influence throughout London, and powerful people sometimes do things difficult to understand." "Did he hurt her? Did he hurt my mother?" Caleb asked, alarmed. "No, not physically," she hastened to clarify. "But there are wounds that leave no visible marks, you understand?" Caleb didn't fully understand, but he nodded. "Your father and your mother came from very different worlds. He was from a traditional family, heir to an empire. She didn't have the pedigree his family demanded. When she became pregnant—" Mrs. Eleanor stopped abruptly, as if she had said too much. "What happened when she became pregnant?" Caleb insisted. "Nothing, she simply left," she replied, but the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. "That's all I can say. If your father finds out we talked about this, I'll lose my job instantly. Please, Mrs. Eleanor, I can't live without knowing who I am anymore." Her eyes welled up. She reached out and touched Caleb's face with an almost maternal tenderness. "You are an incredible boy, Caleb. A boy who deserves much more than this silence they've imposed on you. But I simply can't risk everything now." Frustrated, Caleb pulled away. What intrigued him most was the fear he saw in Mrs. Eleanor's eyes. It wasn't just the fear of losing her job. It seemed something deeper. "Why do you care so much about me?" he asked suddenly. "Why have you always treated me differently from the other staff?" The question caught Mrs. Eleanor by surprise. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "You're a special child, Caleb." But that answer didn't convince him. There was something more, something she was desperately hiding. "You knew her well, didn't you? My mother. Were you friends?" Mrs. Eleanor took a deep breath, as if making a difficult decision. "Yes, I knew her very well, better than anyone else." "Is she alive?" The question escaped Caleb's lips, laden with hope and fear. Before Mrs. Eleanor could answer, they heard the driver's voice calling, "Mrs. Eleanor, telephone for you, it's Mr. Albright." Panic seized her face. She stood up quickly, adjusting her uniform. "I have to go. Please, Caleb, forget this conversation, for your sake and mine." As he watched her walk away, Caleb was certain he was getting closer to the truth, and he was almost sure his mother was alive, perhaps closer than he imagined. In the following weeks, Richard seemed more vigilant, as if he sensed something. He increased his control over Caleb, further restricting his schedule and activities. Most notably, he seemed to monitor the interaction between his son and Mrs. Eleanor more closely. He even hired a new governess, Mrs. Clara, a stern woman who meticulously followed all of her employer's orders. "Mrs. Eleanor has many responsibilities in the house," Richard explained when Caleb questioned the change. "Mrs. Clara will take care of you exclusively now." The forced separation only increased Caleb's suspicions. The few times he managed to exchange a few words with Mrs. Eleanor, he noticed her look of sadness and resignation. It was as if an invisible barrier had been erected between them. One day, while doing homework in the library, Caleb heard raised voices coming from his father's office. He approached the door silently. "The boy is asking questions, Eleanor." Richard's voice was as cold as ever. "You know what happens if he finds out." "He has the right to know the truth," she replied, with a courage Caleb had never imagined in her. "Right?" Richard let out a bitter laugh. "And what truth do you think he should know? That his own mother abandoned him for money, that she preferred a financial agreement to staying with her own son." Caleb's heart stopped. His mother had abandoned him for money. That didn't make sense. It didn't fit the image he was beginning to form of her. "That's not true, and you know it." Mrs. Eleanor's voice rose, almost unrecognizable in her indignation. "It was you who pushed her away, you who threatened to take everything from her, including her child." "Watch your words, Eleanor. You are only here because I allow it, and only under my conditions. If you prefer another arrangement—" "No!" The desperation in her voice was palpable. "Don't do that. You know I can't lose him again." Lose him again? What did she mean by that? Caleb tried to get closer, but his movement made the floorboards creak. Immediately the voices fell silent. "Is anyone there?" Richard asked. Caleb silently ran back to the library, his heart pounding. Seconds later, the office door opened and Richard appeared in the corridor, looking suspiciously around. Seeing no one, he returned to the office, closing the door. That partial conversation left Caleb more confused than ever. Had his mother abandoned him? Or had she been forced to leave him? And what was Mrs. Eleanor's role in all this? Why was she so afraid of losing him again? The next day, during breakfast, Caleb observed Mrs. Eleanor more closely. She served coffee with precise movements, avoiding looking directly at Richard. There was a tension in the air, palpable like electricity before a storm. It was then that Caleb noticed something he had never perceived before. As Mrs. Eleanor leaned over to pour juice, the collar of her blouse opened slightly, revealing a small birthmark on the right side of her neck. A crescent-shaped mark, almost identical to the one he himself had in the same spot. That coincidence made his heart race. Could it be possible? Or was he seeing things that weren't there, desperate for answers? That night, alone in his room, Caleb took a photo of himself and examined it carefully. His eyes, which everyone said were so expressive, his slightly upturned nose, the birthmark on his neck. Looking at those features, he realized he had never wondered who he had inherited them from. Certainly not from Richard, with his angular face and cold eyes. An impossible truth began to form in his mind, a truth as absurd as it was painful. Could Mrs. Eleanor, the woman who had cared for him his entire life, be his real mother? And if so, what cruelty had been imposed on her, forcing her to care for her own son as an employee? The idea was too disturbing to accept. But as sleep overcame him, Caleb promised himself he would get to the bottom of that story, no matter how painful the truth. The suspicion now simmering in Caleb's mind completely changed his perception of reality. Every gesture, every look exchanged between Mrs. Eleanor and his father took on new meanings. He observed the dynamic between the two with different eyes, trying to see the truth behind the daily charade. One Sunday morning, Caleb woke up with a high fever. His body burned, and his head throbbed. Mrs. Clara, the new governess, was off duty, and it was Mrs. Eleanor who came to attend to him, worried as she touched his forehead. "My goodness, you're burning up with fever," she exclaimed, already rushing to fetch the thermometer and medicine. Richard was in Edinburgh for meetings with politicians, which meant Caleb would be in the care of the house staff for the next 2 days. Mrs. Eleanor took charge immediately, dismissing the driver who offered to take him to the hospital. "No need. I know this kind of fever well. I'll take care of him right here," she said, with an authority that surprised everyone. Throughout the day, she stayed by Caleb's bedside, changing cold compresses on his forehead, checking his temperature, and ensuring he drank plenty of fluids. Her gestures were of a devotion that went far beyond professional duty. At night, when the fever peaked, Caleb began to hallucinate. In his semi-conscious state, he called out for a mother he didn't know. Mrs. Eleanor held his hand, silent tears streaming down her face. "I'm here, my son," she whispered, thinking he wouldn't hear her. "Mommy is here." Those words, spoken in the dark of a room where only the faint glow of the bedside lamp revealed their outlines, confirmed what Caleb already suspected. In his feverish delirium, he felt he finally knew the truth, but he needed to be sure. When the fever finally broke in the early hours of the morning, Caleb awoke to find Mrs. Eleanor asleep in the armchair beside his bed, still holding his hand. The soft light of dawn illuminated her face, revealing features he now realized were so similar to his own. Moving carefully so as not to wake her, Caleb approached. Gently, he brushed aside the hair covering her neck, revealing the crescent-shaped birthmark. Identical to his. There were no more doubts. The movement made Mrs. Eleanor wake up. Seeing Caleb so close, examining her birthmark, she understood that something had changed. The boy's eyes, so much like hers, were filled with a newfound understanding. "You are my mother," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Time seemed to freeze. Mrs. Eleanor opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a long moment they just looked at each other, mother and son, separated by years of lies. "I can't deny it anymore," she finally said, her voice almost inaudible. "Yes, Caleb, I am your mother." Those words, so simple yet so powerful, brought down the last wall between them. Caleb threw himself into her arms, sobbing, releasing years of pain and confusion. Mrs. Eleanor, or rather Julia, her real name, hugged him tightly, as if she feared someone might tear him away from her again. "Why?" Caleb asked when he finally managed to speak. "Why did you pretend to be just the governess? Why did you let me think I didn't have a mother?" Julia took a deep breath, knowing it was time to tell the whole truth. "I was very young when I met your father," she began, sitting on the edge of the bed, still holding her son's hands. "I worked as a receptionist at his construction company. Richard was charming, powerful, and I, a naive girl from rural Yorkshire. We fell in love, or at least I fell in love." Her voice trembled as she recounted how their secret romance progressed until she became pregnant. "When I told him, everything changed. The Albright family is one of the most traditional in London. Your paternal grandmother, Mrs. Caroline, was horrified by the idea of her son marrying someone like me without a name, without money. They tried to convince me to—" She hesitated. "To terminate the pregnancy. But I already loved you even before I met you." Caleb listened attentively, each word filling the gaps in his personal history. "Your father gave me an ultimatum. Either I disappeared completely from his life, with a good sum of money, or I stayed. But I would give up all rights to you. He said he would use all his power and influence to destroy me if I tried to fight for you in court, and I believed him." "And you chose the money?" Caleb asked, a lump forming in his throat. "No," she exclaimed, horrified by the idea. "I chose you. The only way to stay close to my son was to accept the role of an employee. Your grandmother, ironically, was the one who suggested the arrangement. She said I could stay and take care of you, but only as a staff member, never as a mother. It was the condition for me not to be completely separated from you." Caleb couldn't believe the cruelty of that agreement. His own mother, forced to watch him grow up, to care for him, without ever being able to reveal who she really was. "Why didn't you run away with me? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I tried once," she confessed, the fear still visible in her eyes as she recalled. "When you were 5, I packed our things while your father was traveling, but he found out, through someone in the house who betrayed me. That night," she shuddered. "He reminded me of the power he had, his connections with judges and politicians. He said that if I tried again, he would never allow me to even look at you, that I would be arrested for attempted kidnapping." "But that's a lie! You're my mother!" "Without legal recognition, without my name on your birth certificate, I had no way to prove it. Your father made sure all documents excluded me completely. Legally, you only have a father." Anger began to grow within Caleb, a fury he had never felt before. "That's unfair. He can't do that." "He did, my son, and he continues to do so." Julia looked at the clock, suddenly alarmed. "He's coming back tomorrow. He can't find us like this. I need to go back to being Mrs. Eleanor before anyone notices." But Caleb was not willing to return to the world of lies. "I don't want to pretend anymore. I want everyone to know you're my mother." Julia held her son's face in her hands, her eyes pleading for understanding. "It's not that simple, Caleb. Your father is a dangerous man when crossed. We need to be smart, act cautiously." "How much longer?" he asked, his voice choked. "How much longer will we pretend? As long as it takes to ensure we can truly be together," she replied, determined. "I need you to promise me you'll keep this secret for now, that you'll continue treating me as Mrs. Eleanor in front of others." Reluctantly, Caleb agreed, but something had changed within him. He now knew the truth, and that truth brought with it a new purpose, a new determination. In the following days, they maintained the charade in public. Caleb continued to call her Mrs. Eleanor when others could hear, but their gazes now carried a deep understanding, a secret bond that no one could break. When they were alone, Julia told stories about her life before the mansion, about her family in Yorkshire, about how she had dreamed of being a teacher. Caleb absorbed every word, every fragment of his mother's story, like dry earth absorbs rain. "You have a grandmother, Mrs. Amelia, who lives in York," Julia told him one night, while folding clothes in Caleb's room, the door carefully closed. "She doesn't even know she has a grandson. Your father made me cut all ties with my family when he found out about the pregnancy. I want to meet her one day," Caleb said, imagining a loving grandmother, so different from his paternal grandmother who only visited on birthdays, bringing expensive gifts and cold smiles. "We will meet her, I promise, when it's safe." But the secret was too heavy to keep for long. Richard, always perceptive, began to notice subtle changes in his son's behavior. The way he looked at Mrs. Eleanor, the proximity he sought, the conversations that silenced when he entered a room. One Saturday afternoon, Caleb was helping Julia in the kitchen, something he never did before, when Richard unexpectedly walked in. He observed the scene with narrowed eyes. His son and the employee side by side, preparing a cake, laughing as if sharing a secret, which, in fact, they were. "Caleb, what are you doing in the kitchen?" he asked, his voice cutting like ice. "I'm helping to make a cake," the boy replied, trying to maintain a natural tone. "That's not an appropriate activity for you. Go to your room. We need to talk." Caleb cast a worried glance at his mother before leaving. Julia remained motionless, her face pale, knowing Richard suspected something. In the office, Richard closed the door and faced his son. "I've noticed your excessive closeness with Mrs. Eleanor. This is inappropriate, Caleb. She is an employee, not a friend or relative." "She's been taking care of me since I was born," Caleb replied, trying to control the growing anger. "Why can't I be close to her?" "Because there are limits that must be respected. And besides," Richard paused, as if calculating his next words, "I'm thinking of letting her go." Caleb's blood ran cold. "What? Why?" "She hasn't been performing her duties adequately. She's distracted, negligent, and she seems to be influencing you in ways I don't approve of." "You can't do that," Caleb exclaimed, forgetting caution. Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised by the intensity of his son's reaction. "I can, and I will, if I deem it necessary. This is my house, Caleb, and you are my son. I do what's best for you." "No, you do what's best for you." The words escaped before he could contain them. "You never cared about how I feel." "This conversation is over," Richard decreed, his voice dangerously calm. "Go to your room and reflect on your behavior. We'll talk later." Trembling with anger and fear, Caleb left the office. He had to warn Julia. He had to do something before Richard sent her away. He couldn't lose his mother now that he had finally found her. That night, while everyone slept, Caleb silently entered Julia's room. "He wants to send you away," he whispered, desperate. "We have to do something." Julia didn't seem surprised, just resigned. "I knew this moment would come," she said, sitting on the bed. "Your father noticed the change between us. He was always very observant." "Let's run away," Caleb proposed impulsively. "Now tonight," Julia smiled sadly, caressing her son's face. "It's not that simple, my love. Without documents, without proof that I am your mother, it would be considered a kidnapping, and this time he would have no mercy. So what are we going to do?" "We need proof," she said thoughtfully. "Something that proves I'm your mother, something your father can't deny or destroy." "What kind of proof?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe there's some document, some photo, something your father has kept." "In his office," Caleb concluded, an idea forming. "There must be something there. It's the only place in the house I've never been able to enter. It's too risky, Caleb." "More risky is losing you," he replied, with a determination that made him seem older than his 12 years. That same night, they made a plan. They would wait for the right moment, when Richard left the mansion for long enough. Then they would enter the office and look for any evidence that could prove Julia's true identity. What they didn't know was that Richard was already one step ahead. Suspicious, he had installed discreet cameras at strategic points in the house, including the corridor leading to Julia's room. And that same night, he watched his son's nocturnal visit to the maid's room, confirming his suspicions. The confrontation was inevitable, and it would come sooner than they expected. Breakfast the next morning was a silent theater of tension. Richard watched Caleb and Julia's every move like a predator studying its prey. Although they maintained the facade of employer, employee, and son, something in the air had irrevocably changed. "Mrs. Eleanor," Richard said, breaking the silence as he drank his coffee, "I need to speak with you in my office after breakfast." Julia nodded without looking up, but Caleb noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she poured more juice. "About what, father?" Caleb asked, trying to sound casual. "House matters that don't concern you," Richard replied dryly. "By the way, your private math tutor will come earlier today. I want you ready in an hour." It was a blatant lie, and Caleb knew it. His private lessons were on Tuesdays and Thursdays, never Sundays. Richard was trying to distance him to confront Julia alone. When Richard left the table, Caleb took the opportunity to whisper, He knows something. Don't go alone. I have to go, she replied equally low. If I refuse, it will be worse. Caleb watched helpless as his mother followed his father to the office. The massive door closed with an ominous click, sealing the two inside. Instead of going to his room as his father had ordered, Caleb silently approached the office. The solid door blocked most of the sound, but pressing his ear against the wood, he could catch fragments of the conversation. "It's lying to me all these years." Richard's voice sounded cold and controlled, more frightening than if he were shouting. "I never lied about my feelings for him." Julia's voice was firm, despite the underlying tremor. "Feelings?" A humorless laugh. "You think this is about feelings? It's about control, Julia. My son, my house, my rules. He's not property, Richard. He's a human being who deserves to know the truth about his origins." "The truth?" Richard's voice rose. "And what would that truth be? That his mother was an opportunist who tried to use a pregnancy to get ahead in life." "That's a lie." Julia's voice now overflowed with indignation. "I loved you. I believed you when you said we would be together." "You believed what you wanted to believe, but that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you broke our agreement. You got close to my son, told him lies, confused his head." "They're not lies. I'm his mother, and he had the right to know." A sound of an object being thrown against the wall startled Caleb. "You are nothing." Richard's voice was now a roar. "Legally, you don't exist in his life. I made sure of that. There isn't a single piece of paper that proves you are my son's mother." "There's proof you can't destroy," Julia replied, with surprising calm. "Our blood, our features, the identical birthmark. Look at us, Richard. Anyone can see we are mother and son. No one will look because you're leaving today. I've already packed your things. The driver will take you to the bus station in an hour. And if you try anything, remember, I have friends who are judges, prosecutors, detectives. One word from me and you'll never see the light of day again." Despair overcame Caleb. They were going to separate him from his mother again. Without thinking twice, he pushed open the office door, bursting into the tense atmosphere. "No," he shouted, positioning himself between Richard and Julia. "You're not sending her away." Richard seemed astonished by the sudden intrusion. Julia, for her part, had tears in her eyes, but there was evident pride at seeing her son's courage. "Caleb, this is none of your business," Richard said, quickly composing himself. "Go back to your room now." "It is my business. She's my mother." The words came out loud and clear, echoing in the ornate office. "She filled your head with these stories, but they're lies, son." Richard tried to use a conciliatory tone, as if speaking to a confused child. "Mrs. Eleanor is disturbed. She needs help, not encouragement." "I know the truth," Caleb insisted. "I saw the birthmark on her neck, just like mine. It's like looking in a mirror and seeing my own eyes." "Why did you lie to me my whole life?" Richard shot a furious glance at Julia. "See what you've done, filled my son's head with fantasies." "They're not fantasies," Caleb interjected, "and I found out on my own. There were clues everywhere, I just didn't want to see them before." Something changed in Richard's expression. The mask of civility completely fell, revealing a coldness Caleb had never witnessed. "Very well," he said, walking to his desk and picking up the phone. "Since you insist on this charade, I'll have to take more drastic measures." "What are you going to do?" Julia asked, fear showing in her voice. "Call my friend, Detective Miller. He'll love to hear about an employee trying to pass herself off as my son's mother to extort money, maybe even claim you were planning a kidnapping." "That's absurd," Julia protested. "Absurd?" Richard smiled, a smile devoid of any warmth. "I have cameras, Julia. I recorded you entering my son's room at night, talking in secret. How do you think that will look to the authorities?" Caleb felt his blood run cold. His father was willing to invent a horrible story, use his power and influence to criminalize his own mother. The injustice was so great he could barely breathe. "If you do that," Caleb said, with a coldness that surprised even himself, "I will never speak to you again. I will never be your son again." Richard paused, the phone halfway to his ear. Something in the boy's words made him hesitate. Behind the mask of power and control, there was a man who, in his own twisted way, loved his son. "You're too young to understand, Caleb," he said, lowering the phone. "There are things we do to protect those we love." "Protect me from what?" "From knowing I have a mother who loves me so much she accepted being humiliated daily just to be near me." A heavy silence settled in the office. It was Julia who broke it. "Richard, what you did was cruel. To him and to me. But we can still fix this. For Caleb's sake." "Fix it?" Richard laughed humorlessly. "Do you have any idea what a scandal it would be if this came out? The Albright reputation would be destroyed. I'd be the laughingstock of London high society." "Is that more important than your son's happiness?" Julia questioned. Before Richard could answer, a sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor, and the office door opened again. It was Mrs. Caroline, Caleb's paternal grandmother, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. "What is going on here?" the grey-haired woman with a regal posture asked. "I heard shouting all the way to the garden." Richard seemed momentarily destabilized by his mother's presence. "Nothing important, Mother, just a misunderstanding with the staff." Mrs. Caroline looked from Richard to Julia and finally to Caleb, who still stood protectively in front of his mother. "It doesn't look like a simple misunderstanding," she observed shrewdly. "Caleb, dear, why are you so upset?" There was something about his grandmother's presence that had always intimidated Caleb. Mrs. Caroline was the pillar of the Albrights, the matriarch who ruled with an iron fist even after being widowed. But at that moment he saw an opportunity. "Grandmother, I discovered that Mrs. Eleanor is my real mother," he said directly, ignoring Richard's alarmed look. "And father wants to send her away forever." Mrs. Caroline showed no surprise, just a slight raising of her eyebrows. "I see," she said calmly. Then she turned to Richard. "I thought we had an agreement on this matter." "And we did," Richard replied, tense, "until she broke the rules and told the boy everything." Julia stepped forward, facing the matriarch for the first time. "I didn't tell him anything. Caleb found out on his own. He's intelligent, observant. He saw what was right in front of everyone." Mrs. Caroline studied Julia for a long moment, then looked at Caleb, analyzing his features. "Yes, the resemblance is undeniable," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. Then, decisively, "Richard, we need to talk privately. Julia, please take Caleb outside." "Mother, I will not allow—" "You will allow what I decide," Mrs. Caroline cut him off, with an authority that silenced her son immediately. "This situation has gone on long enough. It's time we dealt with it as civilized adults, not as medieval despots." Reluctantly, Richard nodded. Julia took Caleb's hand and left the office, closing the door behind them. In the corridor, Caleb held his mother's hand tightly, as if fearing she might disappear at any moment. "What's going to happen now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know, my son," Julia replied, equally uncertain. "Your grandmother has always been tough, but fair in her own way. Perhaps she can make your father see reason. What if she can't? What if he sends you away anyway?" Julia knelt to be at her son's eye level, holding his shoulders firmly. "Listen, Caleb, no matter what happens, no matter where I am, I will always be your mother. Nothing and no one can change that. We will find a way, I promise." The minutes that followed seemed like an eternity. Caleb and Julia waited in the living room, tension and hope mingling in the air. He imagined the arguments being exchanged in the office, the confrontation between mother and son, power against power. Finally, the office door opened, and Mrs. Caroline emerged, followed by a visibly disgruntled Richard. "Julia," the matriarch called, "come here, please." With a last comforting look at Caleb, Julia went to them. Mrs. Caroline spoke in a low voice, words Caleb couldn't distinguish from his distance. He saw his mother nod several times, her expression alternating between concern and something that looked like relief. When she finally returned to Caleb, there was a new sparkle in her eyes. "What happened?" he asked anxiously. "Your grandmother," Julia seemed to search for the right words. "She proposed a new arrangement." "What arrangement?" Julia looked over her shoulder, where Richard and Mrs. Caroline were observing the scene. "Let's talk in the garden," she said, guiding him outside. In the lush garden under the shade of an almond tree, Julia finally explained, "Your grandmother convinced your father to allow the truth to be revealed, but only within these walls. To the outside world, to family, friends, and your father's colleagues, the official story remains the same. But here inside the mansion, we no longer need to pretend. I can be recognized as your mother." Caleb processed the information, contradictory feelings stirring in his chest. "So, you're not leaving?" "No, my son. I will stay here. But we'll still have to lie to everyone outside?" Julia sighed, intertwining her fingers with his. For now, yes. It's the compromise your grandmother managed to extract from your father. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Caleb didn't know whether to be happy or disappointed. On one hand, his mother would remain by his side, recognized within the house. On the other, the truth would still be kept as a shameful secret from the outside world. It's not fair, he murmured. Life rarely is, my love, Julia replied, a sad smile playing on her lips. But we won a victory today. And tomorrow, who knows, we'll win another. That night, as the mansion quieted and the stars appeared in the London sky, a subtle transformation began. Julia was moved to a better room, adjacent to Caleb's. Her employee clothes were replaced by pieces more suited to her new position, not exactly as mistress of the house, but certainly no longer as a servant. For Caleb, the most significant change was being able to call her mother openly, at least when they were alone, or only in the presence of Richard and Mrs. Caroline. It was a word he savored every time he uttered it, like a forbidden sweet he could finally taste. Richard remained distant, clearly uncomfortable with the new arrangement. He spent more time out of the house, returning only to sleep. The Albright Empire continued to demand his attention, and he seemed more than happy to immerse himself in work to avoid the transforming reality of his own home. Mrs. Caroline, surprisingly, showed an easier adaptation. Although she never treated Julia with true affability, there was a reluctant respect in their interactions. One morning, Caleb even caught them conversing civilly about the garden renovation. As the days passed, Caleb began to feel a new lightness, as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He finally knew who he was, where he came from, and most importantly, he knew he was loved, deeply and unconditionally loved by his mother. But deep down, he knew that fragile arrangement was just the beginning of his struggle for truth and justice. A part of him wondered, how long until the outside world found out? And when that happened, would they be ready to face the consequences? 3 months passed since the discovery that had transformed the dynamic of the Albright mansion. The London summer arrived with all its warmth, bathing the gardens in golden light and filling the air with the scent of tropical flowers. To occasional visitors, little had changed. The house remained impeccable. Richard maintained his aristocratic posture, and Caleb was presented as the perfect heir. But behind the appearances, a silent revolution was underway. Julia occupied an ambiguous place in the domestic hierarchy, no longer an employee, but still not fully recognized as part of the family. She wore simple yet elegant clothes, spoke more freely, and participated in meals seated beside Caleb. One particularly warm morning, Caleb entered the kitchen to find his mother preparing breakfast, a habit she had kept despite the change in status. "Why do you still do this?" he asked, watching her cut fruit with the same dedication as before. "Father hired new staff. You don't have to work anymore." Julia smiled, that smile that lit up her whole face and made her eyes, so much like her son's, sparkle. "I like to cook for you, to feel like I'm taking care of my son. Besides," she lowered her voice in a conspiratorial tone, "I've been doing this for so long that I wouldn't know what to do with so much free time." But Caleb was not fooled by the light-hearted answer. He noticed how his mother still seemed out of place in the mansion, occupying spaces cautiously, as if fearing to cross invisible boundaries. "You should be able to do whatever you want," he declared, with the passionate conviction of a 12-year-old. "This is your home now, too." Julia's expression softened into tenderness. "Oh, my son, it's more complicated than that. Your father is trying in his own way. We need to give him time." Caleb was not convinced. Richard's effort consisted mainly of pretending nothing had changed when in public, and barely speaking to Julia when in private. The few times he was forced to acknowledge the new situation were marked by tense and artificial conversations. That afternoon, while studying in the library, Caleb heard raised voices coming from the office. He immediately recognized the participants, his father and his grandmother, arguing once again. "It can't go on like this, Richard," Mrs. Caroline was saying, her voice authoritative even when low. "The boy isn't foolish. He sees how you treat her." "I've made every possible concession," Richard replied defensively. "She lives here, has everything she needs, can be close to her son. What more do they want from me? Respect, for starters. She is your son's mother, whether you like it or not. A mother he only met 3 months ago. I'm the one who raised him all these years." "With her help," Mrs. Caroline reminded him. "Or do you think he would have grown up so well without Julia's care? I saw how she loved him, even when she had to pretend to be just an employee. I saw how she strived to be invisible and yet still be present for him. That requires a kind of courage that you, my son, have never shown." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Caleb barely breathed, afraid of being discovered. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mother?" Richard finally asked. "That it's time to formalize the situation, to legally recognize Julia as Caleb's mother." Richard's response was a bitter laugh. "And destroy everything I've built? The family's reputation? My businesses depend on trust, on respect. If society discovers that I kept my son's mother as an employee under my own roof all these years, society will survive, Richard. The question is, will your son survive more lies?" Caleb quietly walked away, his heart heavy. Even after everything they had been through, his father still saw the situation only from the perspective of his reputation and his businesses. Julia remained an inconvenience, a shameful secret to be hidden. That night, during dinner, the atmosphere was especially tense. Richard, Mrs. Caroline, Caleb and Julia sat at the large table, the silence broken only by the sound of cutlery. Until Richard announced, "I'm organizing a party to celebrate the closing of the contract with the Chinese investors. It will be next Saturday here at the mansion." Caleb and Julia exchanged an apprehensive look. A party meant dozens of guests, members of the London elite who knew Julia only as the Albrights' loyal employee. "I want everyone to be impeccable," Richard continued, avoiding looking directly at Julia. "It's an important moment for the family business." "And where will Julia be during this party?" Mrs. Caroline asked, verbalizing the unspoken question. Richard hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "I thought it would be better if she remained discreet during the event, to avoid unnecessary confusion." "You mean she should hide in her room as if she didn't exist?" Mrs. Caroline's tone was sharp. "It's just for one night, Mother," Richard defended himself, "until we decide how to present the situation to the world." Julia, who had kept her head down during the exchange, finally spoke. "It's all right, Richard. I understand your concern." "No, it's not all right," Caleb exclaimed, banging his fist on the table. "This is ridiculous. Why does my mother have to hide as if she was something shameful?" "Caleb, please," Julia tried to calm him. "No, Mother, I'm tired of this." Tears of frustration glistened in the boy's eyes. "If she doesn't go to the party, I won't either." Richard's expression hardened. "You will attend, yes, it's your duty as my son and heir." "I'm not just your son," Caleb replied, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm her son too, and if no one can know that, I'd rather not be anyone's son." With these words, he stood up and left the dining room, leaving the adults in stunned silence. Julia made a move to follow him, but Mrs. Caroline stopped her with a gesture. "Let him calm down first," she advised. Then, turning to her son, "Do you see what you're doing? Dividing the boy's loyalty, forcing him to choose between you. Is that what you want?" Richard ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability. "What do you suggest I do? Announce to all my partners and friends that I lied for 12 years? That I kept my son's mother as an employee under my own roof?" "The truth always finds its way, Richard," Mrs. Caroline said, with the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to witness many falls and rises. "The longer you try to contain it, the more destructive it will be when it comes out. And it will, make no mistake." That night, Caleb refused to leave his room, even when Julia came to see him. He was furious, hurt, tired of the half-truths and compromises that seemed only to prolong an impossible situation. Lying in his bed, staring at the ceiling, an idea began to form in his mind. A radical, dangerous idea, but one that seemed to him the only way out. The next morning, he appeared in the kitchen with a new determination in his eyes. "Let's leave this place, Mother," he announced without preamble. Julia, who was preparing coffee, turned around in surprise. "What do you mean, son?" "Leave. Go far away, where we can be a real family without needing to hide or pretend." "Caleb, it's not that simple." "Yes, it is," he insisted. "You yourself said you have family in Yorkshire. We can go there, start over." Julia approached, holding her son's face in her hands. "My dear, I understand your frustration, but running away won't solve anything. Your father has resources, influence. He'd find us in a matter of days. Then what are we going to do? Keep living like this forever? You hiding during parties, me pretending at school that I don't have a mother. The despair in Caleb's voice broke Julia's heart. She hugged him tightly, feeling his tears wet her blouse. Not forever, she promised, kissing the top of his head. We're making progress, even if it seems slow. Your father is adjusting to the idea. Your grandmother is on our side. But the words sounded hollow even to herself. Despite the small victories of recent months, the truth was that they remained trapped in a limbo, neither completely free nor totally oppressed. On the eve of the party, the mansion buzzed with activity. Extra staff had been hired for the occasion, decorators transformed the garden into a fairy tale setting, and the chef prepared sophisticated delicacies in the kitchen. Amidst this whirlwind, Julia helped Caleb get ready, adjusting the tie of his first formal suit. "You look handsome," she said with genuine pride. "A true prince." Caleb looked at himself in the mirror without enthusiasm. He hated the idea of the party, hated that his mother would hide in her room throughout the event, hated the falseness of it all. "I don't want to go," he murmured, for the 1,000th time. "I know, my love, but sometimes we have to do things we don't want to, for a greater good." "What greater good?" he asked, skeptical. Julia hesitated, searching for the right words. "Your father is trying in his own way. This party is important to him. If we can show that we are flexible, perhaps he will also yield on other things. He will never change, Mother, don't you see that? To him you will always be a mistake, a shame." The harshness in her son's words made Julia recoil, hurt. Caleb immediately regretted it. "Sorry, I didn't mean that." "It's all right," she forced a smile. "I know you're frustrated, and you have every right to be." That night, as elegantly dressed guests began to arrive, Julia retreated to her room as agreed. Caleb reluctantly joined his father to receive the guests. He smiled politely, answered questions about school, accepted compliments about how much he had grown. But inside he seethed with anger. The party was in full swing when he slipped away to the bedroom corridor. He knocked softly on his mother's door. "Come in," she said, seeming surprised to see him. "Shouldn't you be downstairs?" "I can't take it anymore, Mother. All those fake smiles, that hypocrisy." Caleb threw himself into the armchair in the room. "A lady asked me if I didn't miss a maternal figure, right to my face. And you know what my father said? That some children are blessed with a single, exceptionally dedicated father. As if you didn't exist." Julia sighed, sitting beside her son. "I understand your frustration, my dear. But—" "No," he interrupted. "Don't tell me I have to understand. That it's complicated, that things will get better. I'm tired of waiting." On an impulse, Caleb took his mother's hand. "Come with me, now." "Where?" "To the party. Let's end this charade once and for all." Panic seized Julia's face. "Caleb, no, your father will be furious. It could ruin everything we've built so far." "Built what, exactly? A more comfortable prison?" The bitterness in his voice was palpable. "I prefer the truth, even if it hurts, even if everything falls apart." For a long moment, Julia just looked at her son, seeing in him a determination she recognized in herself years ago, before life and circumstances had made her more cautious. Slowly, almost against her own will, she felt herself yield to his resolve. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Absolutely," he replied without hesitation. "No more hiding who we are." Julia took a deep breath, like someone preparing to dive into unknown waters. "All right, I'll change." 20 minutes later, mother and son walked down the corridor towards the grand ballroom where the party was taking place. Julia had put on her best dress, simple but elegant, and pinned her hair in a sophisticated bun. Even so, her hand trembled as she held Caleb's. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Me too," he confessed. "But we're together." At the top of the grand staircase leading to the main hall, they paused for a moment, observing the scene below. Dozens of people in formal attire, champagne glasses in hand, chatting animatedly. In the center, Richard, impeccable in his dark suit, surrounded by partners and dignitaries. Mrs. Caroline in a corner, conversing with some ladies of her age. "Ready?" Caleb asked, squeezing his mother's hand. "Ready," she replied, with more conviction than she felt. And together they began to descend the stairs, towards an uncertain but finally true future. The buzz of the party gradually subsided, as Caleb and Julia descended the staircase. Like a wave of silence spreading through the hall, guests noticed the unusual scene. The young Albright heir holding hands with the woman who, as far as they knew, was nothing more than a trusted family employee. Richard was the last to notice. He was engrossed in explaining the details of the Chinese contract to a group of investors when he became aware of the sudden silence. Following the gazes of the guests, he turned to see his son and Julia standing at the foot of the stairs, facing the crowd with a courage he had never imagined in them. The blood drained from his face. In seconds he crossed the room. "What do you think you're doing?" he whispered through clenched teeth, forcing a smile for the curious guests. "Ending the lies, father," Caleb replied, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I can't pretend anymore." Julia, pale but resolute, placed her hand on her son's shoulder. "Caleb, perhaps this isn't the moment." "It's the perfect moment," he interrupted, looking directly at Richard. "All your important friends are here. Let's see if you have the courage to tell the truth in front of them." Murmurs began to grow around them. Mrs. Caroline quickly approached the group, assessing the situation with experienced eyes. "What's going on here?" asked one of Richard's oldest partners, a respected gentleman in London society. Richard opened his mouth to reply, but Caleb was quicker. "This is my mother," he declared, with a simplicity that contrasted with the magnitude of the revelation. "My real mother, whom my father forced to work as an employee in this house my entire life, to hide the truth from everyone." A stunned silence fell over the hall. Some guests exchanged shocked glances. Others lowered their eyes, embarrassed to witness such an intimate and painful moment. Richard seemed petrified, torn between fury and despair. Years of building an impeccable image, an unassailable reputation, crumbled before his eyes. It was Mrs. Caroline who broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask that you give us a moment," she said, with the authority that only decades of social respect confer. "Family matters, as you can see. Please, help yourselves to more champagne." With an elegant gesture, she motioned to the waiters to circulate with new trays, while guiding Richard, Julia, and Caleb to the adjacent office. She closed the door behind them, isolating them from the commotion that now took over the party. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Richard exploded as soon as they were alone. "You've ruined everything. Years of work destroyed in seconds." "The only one who destroyed anything here was you, father," Caleb replied, trembling but firm. "You destroyed our family with your lies." Richard advanced threateningly towards his son, but Julia placed herself between them. "Don't you dare touch him," she said, with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including herself. "You've caused enough damage." "Damage?" Richard laughed humorlessly. "I gave this boy everything, education, privileges, opportunities you could never offer. And this is how you thank me? Exposing me as a liar in front of all society?" "Is that what worries you?" Mrs. Caroline interjected, observing her son with a mixture of disappointment and resignation. "Your reputation, what others will think. Don't you realize that's precisely the problem?" Richard collapsed into an armchair, running his hands over his face in a gesture of pure exhaustion. "How will I face these people now?" "With the truth," Mrs. Caroline replied simply. "It's already done, Richard. The secret is out. Now all that's left is to decide how to deal with the consequences." Outside, the party continued, but with a different energy. Guests were divided between those who pretended nothing had happened and those who openly whispered about the bombshell revelation. Some were already preparing their goodbyes, eager to spread the gossip through the halls of London high society. In the office, Caleb watched the adults discuss his future with a strange sense of relief. Yes, he had created chaos, and yes, his father would probably never forgive him for it. But for the first time in his life, he felt completely honest. The truth, however painful, was finally exposed. "We need to go back out there," Richard said finally, adjusting his jacket with what dignity he could muster. "Give some kind of explanation." "What kind of explanation do you think will be sufficient?" Julia asked skeptically. "The truth," Caleb interrupted. "Only the truth will do now." The three adults looked at the boy, surprised by his lucidity and firmness. "The truth is complicated, son," Julia said softly. "Then simplify it," he replied. "Say you loved each other, that you had a child, that circumstances separated you. It's not a lie. The details don't matter to strangers." Richard stared at his son for a long moment, seeing him for the first time not as a child, but as someone with a moral understanding that he himself, in all his adult sophistication, had never achieved. "Let's go," he said finally, opening the office door. When they returned to the ballroom, the guests pretended normalcy, but all eyes converged on the Albright family. Richard ascended 2 steps of the staircase, asking for silence with a gesture. "My friends," he began, his voice more trembling than anyone had ever heard it, "I owe you an explanation for the incident earlier." The silence was absolute now. Julia and Caleb remained at the foot of the stairs, side by side, while Mrs. Caroline watched everything with the keen eye of someone who had witnessed many family storms. 12 years ago," Richard continued, "when my son was born, I made decisions that I believed were best for everyone involved. Decisions that, looking back, were motivated more by pride and prejudice than by love." He paused, as if the words cost him physical effort. "Julia is Caleb's biological mother. Our relationship was complicated. For reasons I prefer not to detail, I decided it would be better for everyone that she remained close, but not as—" He hesitated. "Not as the mother she should have been." Murmurs resumed, some of surprise, others of belated understanding. "I know many of you are shocked. Others perhaps already suspected. The important thing is that my son took an action I never had the courage to take. He demanded the truth, and however uncomfortable it may be, he is right." Caleb could barely believe what he was hearing. His father, the proud Richard Albright, publicly admitting he was wrong? It was almost inconceivable. "From now on," Richard concluded, "I ask that you respect our privacy as we reorganize our family. The party is officially over. I thank you all for your understanding." The guests began to disperse, some offering words of support, others simply saying goodbye with embarrassed nods. In half an hour the mansion was practically empty, leaving behind only the Albright family and the staff, who hastened to clean up the remnants of the interrupted party. In the silence that followed, Richard, Julia, Caleb and Mrs. Caroline sat in the living room, emotionally and physically exhausted. No one knew exactly what to say. The cards were on the table, the truth had been exposed, but what would come next was still unknown. "The phone won't stop ringing for the next few days," Mrs. Caroline commented, pragmatic as always. "Press, curious friends, gossips on duty." "We can deal with that later," Richard said, pouring himself a generous whiskey. He offered one to Julia, who declined with a gesture. "What happens now?" Caleb asked, the adrenaline of the night beginning to give way to anxiety about the future. The 3 adults exchanged uncertain glances. "I suppose that depends mainly on you two," Mrs. Caroline said, indicating Richard and Julia. "What do you want for the future?" Julia was the first to answer. "I want to be legally recognized as Caleb's mother. I want my name on his birth certificate. I want to be able to take him to meet my family in Yorkshire, introduce him to the grandmother who never knew she had a grandson." Richard nodded slowly. "I can arrange that. I have contacts in the judiciary who can expedite the process." "And then," Caleb insisted, "are we going to keep living here, the 3 of us?" The question hung in the air, laden with implications. Could a harmonious coexistence be possible after so many years of lies and resentment? Could they, somehow, form a real family? "I think that depends on many conversations we still need to have," Julia replied cautiously. "Your father and I have a lot to resolve, a lot to forgive." Richard looked at her, really looked, as he hadn't in years. He saw not the naive young woman he had known, nor the submissive employee he had tolerated, but a strong woman who, despite everything, had never given up on her son. "Yes," he agreed, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We have a lot to talk about." Mrs. Caroline stood up, smoothing her elegant dress. "I think this is my cue to retire. You 3 need time alone." She kissed her grandson on the forehead, lightly squeezed her son's shoulder, and, to everyone's surprise, briefly held Julia's hand before leaving. In the silence that followed, Caleb felt exhaustion take over his body. So many emotions, so much adrenaline, and now finally the possibility of peace. No secrets, no lies, just the raw truth and the chance to build something new upon it. "I'm proud of you," Julia said, sitting beside her son and stroking his hair. "You showed a courage that neither your father nor I ever had." "Did I do the right thing?" he asked, suddenly insecure. I didn't want to destroy everything. Sometimes, Richard interjected, surprising both of them, we need to destroy to rebuild. I think that's what you did today, son. It was the first time Richard had addressed him with genuine respect, as an equal. Caleb felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. I apologize, Richard continued, the words coming out with difficulty. To you, Caleb, for depriving you of the truth about your origins. And to you, Julia, for... His voice faltered. For everything. For every humiliation. Every day I made you live a lie. Julia watched him with a complex expression, where years of hurt mixed with a profound relief at finally hearing those words. It will take time, she said honestly. I can't promise to forgive everything at once, but for Caleb I'm willing to try. Richard nodded, understanding the magnitude of the offer. After everything he had done, any chance of redemption was more than he deserved. Caleb looked from one to the other, feeling for the first time that perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way forward. Not as the perfect family they never were, but as real imperfect people, united by their love for him and by the truth that had finally set them free. That night, as the mansion quieted and London shone outside, Caleb fell asleep with a sense of peace he had never experienced before. The truth was exposed, the air was clear, and tomorrow would be the first day of the rest of their lives. Imperfect, complicated lives, but finally authentic. The months following the revelation at the party were a period of profound transformation for the Albright family. As Mrs. Caroline had predicted, the news spread quickly through London high society circles. Some cut ties, indignant at the scandal. Others offered sincere support, admiring Richard's belated courage in embracing the truth. Albright Construction suffered an initial shake-up. Some more conservative investors withdrew their support, concerned about the company's image. But most business partners, especially foreign ones, showed little interest in Richard's personal life, as long as contracts continued to be fulfilled. Within the mansion, a new dynamic slowly established itself. Julia now occupied a larger room next to Caleb's, decorated according to her simple but elegant tastes. In the first few weeks, it was common for Caleb to wake up in the middle of the night and go there, just to make sure she was still there, that it hadn't all been a dream. Richard, for his part, proved to be a changed man. Wounded pride had given way to a reluctant but genuine humility. For the first time in his life, he strove to listen more than to speak, to understand rather than to impose. Family meetings, once rare and formal, became more frequent and warmer, with Julia and Caleb actively participating in decisions. One sunny September morning, as they had breakfast on the balcony overlooking the Thames, Richard brought a large envelope and placed it on the table. "What's that?" Caleb asked, curious. "Open it," Richard replied with a discreet smile. Inside the envelope, a new birth certificate. In the mother field, where there had previously been only a blank space, now appeared the full name, Julia Mary Oliver Albright. Julia took the document with trembling hands, her eyes welling up. "How did you get this so fast?" she asked, running her fingers over the printed name, as if to make sure it was real. "Let's just say some doors opened more easily for me," Richard replied, without going into details about the favors called in and the strings pulled. "The important thing is that it's done. Officially, Caleb now has a mother in the eyes of the law." Caleb watched the scene with a happiness that barely fit in his chest. It was as if a missing part of his identity had finally fallen into place. He was no longer just the Albright heir, but also Julia's son, with all the emotional and cultural heritage that implied. "There's one more thing," Richard continued, pulling another envelope from his pocket. "Tickets to York for the weekend. I thought maybe it was time for Caleb to meet the other part of his family." Julia let out a small gasp of surprise. She hadn't spoken to her mother in over 12 years, ever since Richard had separated her from everything she knew. The few letters she had sent over the years had been intercepted, never reaching their destination. You'll allow it?" she asked, barely believing. "It's not a matter of allowing, Julia," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "It's your right. It's his right. I bought 3 tickets, but I'll understand if you prefer to go just the 2 of you." Julia and Caleb exchanged a look, a silent communication that had become common between them in recent months. "I think we should all 3 go," Caleb finally said. "As a family." The word family still sounded strange when applied to the 3 of them together, but no one challenged it. It was what they were trying to build, after all. Not the perfect family from margarine commercials, but something real, with all the scars and imperfections of their individual stories. The following weekend, they boarded the flight to Leeds, from where they would drive to York. Caleb, who had never left London, looked out the window with fascination as the landscape gradually changed, the coast giving way to the mountains of Yorkshire. Julia grew more nervous with each mile travelled. How would her mother react to seeing her after so long? Would she believe her when she told the whole story? And most importantly, would she accept Caleb as her grandson? Mrs. Amelia's small house was on a cobblestone street, typical of York's colonial architecture. The colourful flowers in the front garden contrasted with the white walls and blue windows. When they stopped the rented car in front of the wooden gate, Julia felt her legs tremble. "I don't know if I can do it," she murmured. "We're with you," Caleb assured her, holding her hand. Richard, in the driver's seat, remained silent. It was, perhaps, the first time in his life he felt completely out of his element, without the control he was accustomed to. The sound of the doorbell echoed inside the house. Slow footsteps approached, and the door opened, revealing a grey-haired lady with the same warm smile Julia had inherited. "Yes?" she began, before her eyes registered who was before her. "My goodness, and Julia, mother," was all Julia could say before tears overtook her. The embrace that followed seemed to want to compensate for every day of the 12 lost years. Mrs. Amelia cried openly, touching her daughter's face as if to make sure she wasn't an apparition. "My girl, I thought I'd never see you again," she said between sobs. "Why did you disappear like that? Not a phone call, not a letter." "It's a long story, Mother," Julia replied, wiping away her tears. "But first, I want you to meet someone." She gently pulled Caleb forward. The boy, usually so confident, now seemed shy and vulnerable. "This is Caleb, my son. Your grandson." Mrs. Amelia's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with a new emotion: wonder. She looked from her grandson to her daughter, immediately identifying the resemblances. "My grandson," she repeated, incredulous. "You had a son and never told me?" "Not by choice, Mother," Julia's voice choked. "As I said, it's a long story." It was then that Mrs. Amelia noticed Richard's presence, who had remained discreetly aloof. "And you are Richard Albright," he introduced himself, extending his hand formally. "Caleb's father." Something in the name seemed to spark a memory in Mrs. Amelia. "Albright? From Albright Construction?" When Richard nodded, she frowned. "The man my daughter worked for?" The discomfort was visible on Richard's face. "Yes, ma'am, but as Julia said, it's a complicated story." "How about we go inside?" Julia suggested, noticing the rising tension. "We can explain everything calmly." The following hours were filled with painful revelations, tears, indignation, and finally a reluctant acceptance. Mrs. Amelia oscillated between anger at everything her daughter had endured and the joy of finally meeting her only grandson. Caleb, in turn, drank in every detail of his mother's previous life, photos of her as a child, stories of her youth, family traditions he had never known. "So you worked as an employee in your own son's house all these years?" Mrs. Amelia asked, still incredulous, looking accusingly at Richard. "How could you do that to my daughter?" Richard, who had always had a ready answer for everything, found himself speechless. How to explain decisions made so long ago, motivated by pride, prejudice, and fear? How to justify the unjustifiable? "I have no excuses for what I did, ma'am," he finally said. "I can only say that I am trying to correct my mistakes now. Late, I know, but sincerely." "It's true, Mother," Julia interjected, surprising everyone. "Richard has been making an effort in recent months. Things have changed a lot." Mrs. Amelia studied her daughter's face, looking for signs that she was being coerced or manipulated. Finding nothing but tired sincerity, she sighed deeply. "Well, what matters is that you're here now. And you brought my grandson." She turned to Caleb with a radiant smile. "Such a handsome and polite grandson. I'll need time to get to know him properly, to make up for all these years." "We can come whenever you want," Caleb assured her, already feeling a special connection with that warm grandmother, so different from Mrs. Caroline's formality. The lunch that followed was more relaxed, with Mrs. Amelia serving typical Yorkshire dishes that Caleb had never tasted. Richard, initially reserved, gradually joined the conversations, showing a more relaxed and approachable side that surprised even Julia. At the end of the day, when they returned to the guest house where they would be staying, Caleb felt filled with a new happiness. He had discovered a part of himself he didn't even know was missing, his maternal roots, the welcoming simplicity of a family that valued affection above status. "Thank you for bringing me here," he said to Julia as they prepared for bed. "It's like I finally found the other half of myself." Julia smiled, moved by her son's perception. "You always had both halves within you, my love. You just didn't know how to recognize them." The weekend in York marked the beginning of a new phase. In the following months, visits became regular. Mrs. Amelia was eventually invited to spend seasons at the mansion in London, bringing with her an informality and warmth that transformed the atmosphere of the house. Richard, despite all the changes, remained Richard. Ambitious, sometimes distant, often absorbed by work. But there were moments during a family dinner or watching one of Caleb's school presentations when he demonstrated a capacity for emotional connection that had previously seemed impossible. Julia blossomed with her newfound freedom. She resumed her studies interrupted decades ago, enrolling in a pedagogy course, her youthful dream. Gradually, she built a life that went beyond being Caleb's mother or Richard's ex, an identity of her own, with independent friendships and interests. As for Richard and Julia as a couple, the situation remained undefined. There was a growing mutual respect, occasional moments of complicity when it came to Caleb, but the scars of the past were too deep to allow for any immediate romance. If they would ever become a real couple again, only time would tell. 1 year after the party that changed everything, Caleb turned 13. The celebration, unlike his previous birthdays, was simple and genuine. There was none of the usual all-bright ostentation, just the people who truly mattered. Julia, Richard, Mrs. Caroline, Mrs. Amelia, and a few school friends he could finally bring into his real life. During the party, Caleb observed the adults interacting, his mother animatedly discussing her course, his father debating politics with a teacher, the two grandmothers exchanging recipes like old friends. It was an improbable scene, almost surreal considering where they had started. In a quiet moment, he found Julia alone on the balcony, admiring the sunset over Hyde Park. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, approaching her. She smiled, that smile she could now display freely, without fear or restrictions. "How life comes full circle," she replied, putting her arm around her son's shoulders. "A year ago, I was still Mrs. Eleanor, the employee. I lived in constant fear of being discovered, of being separated from you. Now I'm here, publicly your mother, studying, rebuilding my life. It almost feels like a dream." "It's not a dream," Caleb assured her, resting his head on her shoulder. "It's real. We built this together." From the balcony door, Richard watched mother and son embracing against the orange sky. There was a time when the scene would have filled him with jealousy and resentment. Now he felt only a strange peace. It wasn't the family he had planned, nor the life he had imagined, but there was an authenticity in this new configuration that, he realized with surprise, made him happier than all the artificial perfection he had tried to maintain for so many years. He approached slowly, uncertain if his presence would be welcome in that intimate moment. "May I join you?" he asked, with an unusual hesitation in his voice. Julia and Caleb exchanged a quick glance, then made room between them. "Of course, father," Caleb replied, extending his arm. The three stood there side by side, watching the sun disappear on the horizon. They were not a perfect family, far from it. There were wounds not yet fully healed, constant adjustments, occasional relapses into old patterns. But it was real, true, built not on appearances and social expectations, but on the most solid foundation that exists, the truth. As the first stars began to dot the London sky, Caleb knew with the certainty that only the heart provides that they had found their way. Not the easiest path, nor the most obvious, but the only one that would allow them to be who they truly were, imperfect, complicated, but finally free. And in that moment of clarity, he understood that his story, his family's story, was not about luxury or privilege, nor even about secrets or revelations. It was ultimately about the most fundamental quest of every human being, the right to know their origins, to love and be loved honestly, to exist in the clear light of truth. "Happy birthday, my son," Julia whispered, kissing his forehead. "Happy birthday, Caleb," Richard repeated, lightly squeezing his shoulder. And Caleb, feeling more complete than ever before, knew that this was indeed the most valuable gift he could receive. A real family, with all its complications, but finally true. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Caleb, Julia, and Richard's journey has touched your hearts. The power of truth, the strength of maternal love, and the human capacity to grow and change are themes that resonate with all of us. For more heartwarming stories like this, we've prepared a special playlist you can find by clicking the link to the left of your screen. If this narrative moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Every day we bring new stories that explore the complexity of human relationships, revealing beauty where we least expect it. Share your impressions in the comments about this family who, despite all adversities, found their way to the truth. We look forward to reading your opinions and suggestions for future stories.